The moment everyone finished clapping after my father's eulogy, my stepmother leaned over the casket and whispered into my ear, "Sign over your $700,000 to me, or get out of this family." Her breath was cold and sharp, cutting straight through the quiet sanctuary of St. Andrew Church in Portland. I was still standing with one hand on the polished wood of my father's casket, the lilies around us heavy with scent, the last notes of the organ still fading in the air. I turned my head slowly because, for a second, I genuinely thought I had misheard her. Lydia was wearing a perfect black dress, the kind that looked more suited for a charity gala than a funeral. Her clutch matched her heels, her red nails gleamed under the stained glass light, and yet her eyes were flat calculating, already moving past the man she claimed to love. She tilted her head closer as if we were sharing a private joke. There was nothing soft or grieving about her tone. It was the voice of someone demanding a discount at a department store, not someone discussing the life insurance of the man lying inches away. The unfairness hit me before the shock did. I had been the one running to the hospital every night after work, signing paperwork for chemo treatments, sitting beside my father during the long hours he drifted in and out of consciousness at OHSU Hospital. For 6 months, I lived between spreadsheets at my job and beeping monitors in my father's room. Lydia, meanwhile, appeared only when a camera could capture her arriving at the hospital, with perfect makeup posting captions online about how hard it was to be a devoted wife, then disappearing as quickly as she came. As we stood together at the casket, I felt a tug on my wrist. One of my aunts was glancing over confused because she could see Lydia's fingers wrapped around my arm. She could not hear the words, but she saw enough to know something was deeply wrong. I bit my lips so hard the skin broke. I tasted metal but refused to move. Lydia tightened her grip and delivered the next blow. "You owe me. I took care of your father for more than 10 years. That $700,000 is ours, not yours. Ours." Her emphasis on the word ours echoed inside my skull. She had never seen me as family, not even when I tried to make peace, not even when my father begged her to treat me with some compassion. But somehow, she believed she was entitled to the money he left behind. I did not cry. I did not whisper back or cause a scene. Instead, I looked at her and let a small smile rise to my lips. It was not a happy smile. It was controlled quiet, the kind of smile that made Lydia blink and loosen her grip as if she suddenly remembered she did not know me as well as she pretended. "Fine," I said softly. "If you want everything to be clear, I will make it very clear." At that exact moment, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I recognized the vibration pattern. I pulled it out just far enough to see the preview on the screen. Chief Risk Officer, Cascade Federal Bank. "We need your final approval on the fraud report, Jade." I pressed the power button and slid the phone back into my coat. No one around us knew what that message meant. They did not know I had just helped uncover one of the largest fraud attempts our credit union system had seen all year. They did not know federal investigators had been quoting parts of my analytic model in meetings for weeks. They did not know the quiet girl Lydia mocked was the reason millions of dollars were protected. They did not know any of that because I never told them. To my family, I was just Jade, quiet, polite, the girl who worked with computers, the girl Lydia claimed made barely anything, the girl she told everyone was always begging her father for help. So I let them believe that. I let Lydia believe that more than anyone, because sometimes being underestimated is the sharpest weapon you can carry. My name is Jade Reed. I am 29 years old. I work as a senior data analyst for a network of credit unions across the Pacific Northwest, where I specialize in detecting unusual transaction patterns and investigating financial exploitation. My colleagues respect me. My supervisors trust me. But my family never cared enough to ask what I actually do. Lydia made sure they believed her version of me, a burden, an ungrateful daughter. A woman with no real future unless she clung to the generosity of others. On the day of the funeral, I decided that letting them think I was weak would serve me far better than correcting them. Because once someone like Lydia convinces herself you are powerless, she never sees the moment you stand up. That afternoon, surrounded by white flowers and the last warmth of my father's memory, I chose silence not as surrender, but as strategy. Let Lydia think I was bending. Let her think she had already won. Let her think $700,000 was already in her pocket. She would come to understand the truth soon enough, and when she finally understood who she had tried to corner, it would not be in private. It would be in the full light of day. If you have ever had someone treat your hard work or inheritance as something they deserve more than you do, type "I've been there" and tell me where you are watching from. I live in a small rented apartment in the Boise neighborhood of Portland, a modest corner unit with beige walls and a balcony that overlooks a row of maple trees, the kind of place no one would ever associate with influence or high income. And that is exactly how I prefer it, because the living room looks intentionally plain with a small couch, a thrifted coffee table, a cheap lamp from a clearance sale, while my real world is tucked into the back bedroom where 2 monitors glow late into the night, one stacked with lines of code and transaction logs, the other open to analytics dashboards and encrypted email threads. But to anyone who walks in, especially to people like Lydia, it looks like a simple apartment for a simple girl. As I stood there the night after the funeral lights' low rain tapping lightly against the window, my mind drifted back to the years when Lydia started shaping how everyone saw me, the years when she made sure I was always the burden, always the girl no one had to take seriously. I was 17 when she first took control of my father's finances in a way that looked helpful on the surface, but carried rot underneath. She walked around the house with binders of bills, organized folders, and that triumphant smile she used whenever she felt powerful. And one afternoon she sat at the kitchen counter and told my father that it made no sense for me to have a credit card linked to his account because teenagers were irresponsible. Then she canceled the card without warning and told the family group chat that I had been using it to buy unnecessary things, even though the only purchases on it were gas groceries and school supplies. I remember hearing her laugh on the phone with one of her sisters telling her I had probably quit college already, or would eventually. Because I lacked discipline, she liked painting that picture of me. The irresponsible daughter, the one my father had to rescue over and over, the one who would crumble without her guidance. The truth was that I spent every hour I could working part-time at a coding lab on campus and applying for scholarships, and I graduated with a degree in data science that took everything I had to earn. But when I walked across the stage on graduation day, Lydia told everyone she met that I got lucky, rather than admitting how hard I had fought for it. She had a way of twisting reality until even the people who once believed in me began to doubt me, and sometimes I doubted myself too. Because her voice was always there, sharp and smug, saying things like, "If your father did not help you, you would be washing dishes somewhere, or women do not need to understand money. Leave that to the men," as if she had ever earned a dollar that was not connected to my father's accounts. I learned to swallow my anger quietly, to let her talk, to let her perform her version of who I was, while privately building a world she would never be able to measure. There was one night during my first job out of college when everything shifted for me, a night that no one in my family ever heard about, because I never told them the night I discovered a fraud pattern in one of our regional banks, a pattern hidden inside a complicated chain of microtransactions that every automated system missed. But I saw it. I followed it. I stayed in the office until dawn with spreadsheets open across all screens, and when the investigation was complete, it turned out that the pattern was linked to a coordinated attempt to steal more than $5 million from vulnerable customer accounts. Money that was saved, because I caught it early. Money that was protected, because I trusted my instinct money that I never bragged about, not even once. My manager took me out for lunch the next day and told me that if I stayed on this path, I would lead an entire department one day. But when my father asked how work was going, I simply said it was normal, because the last thing I wanted was for Lydia to turn my achievement into another excuse to claim I was being dramatic or seeking attention. I learned over time that secrets are sometimes armor, the quiet kind that no one sees coming, and the less I said, the freer I became. But my memories kept drifting further back to when I was 21, and Lydia almost ruined my father financially, a mistake she lied about so convincingly that everyone believed she had saved him instead. She had signed for a loan he never approved, a predatory agreement pushed on her through a door-to-door contractor, promising a home energy upgrade that my father never wanted. And when the collector letters started coming in, she told everyone my father had made an error. She cried in front of relatives. She told neighbors her hands were tied, and she convinced my father that the only way out was to refinance part of the house. But what she did not know was that I had been reading the contract, analyzing the terms, and I realized quickly that the contractor had violated several state disclosure requirements. I took the documents to a lawyer my college advisor recommended and asked him what options my father had. He drafted a letter that cited Oregon law, and within a week the contractor voided the agreement entirely. My father never knew that the letter came from me because Lydia told him she handled everything. She even said she'd spent days negotiating on the phone. And when she told that story at Thanksgiving, the entire family praised her for being such a responsible wife, while I sat silently at the corner of the table and let them believe whatever made them feel comfortable. None of them knew that the person they dismissed, the one they called dramatic or ungrateful, had been quietly protecting the family in ways they would never understand. That memory stayed with me as I stood in my small Boise apartment after the funeral, the glow of my monitors reflecting on the walls as rain streaked the window, because it reminded me that I had always been capable, always been stronger than the version Lydia created. And it also reminded me that when someone underestimates you long enough, the moment you finally stand up becomes far more powerful than anything they could prepare for. In the 6 months leading up to my father's passing, the world around me narrowed into a routine of hospital spreadsheets and sleepless nights, the kind of routine that leaves a permanent mark on your bones. And it began on the day the oncologist at OHSU sat us down and calmly explained that my father, Michael Reed, had late-stage pancreatic cancer, and that treatment would only buy time rather than offer hope. A moment that carved itself into my memory with terrifying clarity as Lydia pressed a tissue to her eyes, even though no tears formed while I gripped the arms of my chair and tried to stay upright. Within hours, Lydia sent a dramatic message to the family group chat, writing that she would be the one carrying everything on her shoulders because Jade is too busy with her own life and hardly helps at all, and the messages of sympathy poured in for her, while I sat in my car outside the hospital, rereading her words and feeling that familiar sting of being painted as absent when I had just spent the entire appointment absorbing news that shattered me from the inside out. The truth was far different from Lydia's script because I was the one who drove my father to every chemo session, navigating Portland traffic before dawn, helping him into the car, holding his arm as we walked slowly through the quiet halls of the cancer center, settling him into the recliner while the IV line clicked into place. Then opening my laptop to work remotely from the small patient family desk, running fraud risk analysis, while listening to the steady hum of infusion pumps, and when he grew too tired to eat, I ordered food and paid with my own account, since Lydia insisted the joint card was not to be used for anything unnecessary. There were nights when my father felt too weak to stay at home, and I slept in the reclining chair next to his hospital bed, answering emails between nurse check-ins and stepping outside only long enough to stretch my legs before returning to hold his hand when he stirred. Yet every few days, Lydia arrived in a swirl of perfume and designer fabric, posing by the window for a photo, with her hand gently placed on my father's blanket, posting captions like praying for my dear husband or grateful for every moment, and once the live stream ended, she would check her makeup in her phone camera and turn to me with that sharp smile saying, "Do not get dramatic about what you do, because people only remember the face in front of the camera." I learned to let her comments slide off me, not because they did not hurt, but because I refused to let her poison take root in the limited energy I had left, and my father always squeezed my hand afterward as if he knew I needed reassurance. One afternoon during his 3rd month of chemo, a nurse approached me as I was settling into my corner with my laptop, and she hesitated before asking if I was the same Jade Reed who gave the big fraud analytics talk online last year, her voice full of excitement as she talked about how the nursing staff had shared the video because of how clearly I explained financial exploitation patterns, and I felt my face warm with embarrassment as I told her it was just work stuff, hoping Lydia would not overhear, because she would twist that recognition into another accusation of arrogance or attention-seeking. That moment was a small reminder that there was a world outside the silent battles I fought around my father's hospital bed, a world where my knowledge mattered and where people respected my mind, a reminder I clung to in order to survive the suffocating dynamic Lydia created every time she entered the room. As the months passed, I witnessed Lydia's attention to my father diminish in proportion to her interest in controlling the narrative, and I began noticing her stepping out of the room often to take calls, speaking in hushed tones, by the elevators, or pacing with an irritated expression when she thought no one was watching. One particularly cold evening in December, I stepped out of the room to get my father warm tea and froze when I heard Lydia's voice around the corner, strained and impatient, as she told someone on the phone that she needed to know whether she could apply for an advance or a loan based on the life insurance amount, because once he passes, I cannot wait months for the payout. And if I can use his condition to qualify early, then I want the paperwork ready. My breath caught as I clutched the cup in my hand, the steam rising into my face while my heartbeat pressed heavily against my ribs, because her words were not just cruel, they were predatory. And I knew then that she was planning something far worse than simply demanding attention from the family. I stepped back quietly, letting her finish the call, and when she returned to the room, she immediately began fussing with the blanket and adjusting her hair, acting like the doting spouse she loved to perform, while my father slept unaware of how she was using his suffering as leverage for her financial gain. That moment planted the first real seed of suspicion in me, a suspicion that grew heavier with each passing week as I balanced my work, my father's care, and the ever-widening cracks in Lydia's facade. And even though I kept my voice steady and my face neutral, I knew I would eventually need to find out just how far she was willing to go. A few weeks before my father became too weak to leave the hospital, he asked me to stop by the house in Gresham one evening, a house that still smelled faintly of my mother's vanilla candles. Even though she had been gone for years, a house filled with quiet memories that Lydia never managed to erase, no matter how many abstract paintings or new throw pillows she tried to add. And when I stepped inside that night, I felt a tension in the air that made me pause by the doorway as he sat at the kitchen table wrapped in his old flannel shirt. He looked tired but alert, his eyes softer than they had been in months, and he motioned for me to sit as he slid a plain white envelope across the table, his hands trembling slightly, and when I opened it, I felt my breath tighten, because inside was the life insurance policy with my name written clearly as the sole beneficiary, $700,000, designated to Jade Reed with a signature date that went back years before his illness had even started. He watched my reaction and spoke quietly, telling me that he had made the decision when he realized Lydia would never see me as her own, and that he wanted me to have something that could not be taken from me, something that would allow me to live freely without needing to rely on anyone else. And he squeezed my hand as he said, "Do not let anyone pressure you to give this up. Not now. Not ever." I wanted to tell him everything then, all the nights I spent worrying about his comfort, all the ways I had been holding myself together while Lydia played the role of perfect spouse, for the world to see all the doubts and fears that kept me awake when I drove home from the hospital. But he shook his head gently before I could speak, saying that staying silent about the policy was not a betrayal, but a form of protection, because the less Lydia knew, the safer I would be once he was gone. I understood what he meant, and it scared me because it meant he had seen through her far earlier than I realized. He had watched her patterns, her manipulation, and he had chosen secrecy as the only shield he could give me. Even though I nodded, a part of me wanted to walk into the living room and call the entire family right then to make everything public, to expose Lydia's lies and let the truth tear down the image she built. But he held my hand a little tighter and whispered that sometimes silence buys time and time buys safety, and that for now I needed to trust him. After he went to rest in the bedroom, I lingered in the house, the ticking of the old wall clock echoing through the hallway as I walked into the study, a room Lydia rarely entered because it was filled with books and files she never cared to understand, and on the desk sat his laptop with a folder labeled "Personal" tucked beside a stack of medical bills. I hesitated before opening it because I felt like I was intruding on something private. But I also knew my father would not have called me over if he did not want me to see more. So I lifted the lid and clicked through the recent emails. And that was when I saw a message thread from only 2 weeks earlier addressed to his lawyer. The email was calm and concise, written in the tone my father always used when he was trying to remain rational, while worried, asking if it was possible to remove Lydia from certain joint accounts, because he believed there had been withdrawals he did not authorize, and he wanted to know his options before confronting her. My heart dropped as I reread the message, realizing that my father had been trying to protect himself even while he was fighting for his life, and the weight of that truth pressed down on me harder than any accusation Lydia had ever thrown my way. I sat there for a long time staring at the screen, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic outside, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, but a deep, steady certainty that I would not let my father's concern be ignored, that I would follow the trail he had started, even if he did not have the strength to finish it. As I closed the laptop and turned off the study light, I remembered the other secret I carried, one Lydia would never imagine, because she always assumed I scraped by on some mediocre salary, the secret that I had saved enough, through my work and bonuses, to buy a small duplex in Vancouver, Washington. 2 years earlier, a modest place, but fully paid under my name. A property I kept quiet because I never wanted Lydia to twist it into some narrative about me using my father's money. The tenants living there paid rent on time every month, and it became a source of steady passive income, a financial safety net I built entirely on my own. And as I locked my father's front door behind me that night, I realized that between his life insurance policy, the truth hidden in his emails, and the quiet assets I had accumulated, the story Lydia told everyone about me being helpless was beginning to crack. She did not know it yet, but the version of me she ridiculed at family dinners and dismissed as insignificant was already gaining ground. And when the time came for everything to surface, the truth would not whisper, it would roar, and she would finally understand that the girl she called a burden had been preparing for a storm she never saw coming. The night my father passed away is a night I will never forget, not because of the quiet beeping of the ICU monitors or the way the fluorescent lights softened around the edges, as if the world itself knew it needed to dim for him, but because of who was not there and what she was doing while the man who had cared for her through every season of their marriage took his last breaths. Lydia had left the hospital hours earlier, claiming she could not bear to watch him decline any further, wiping a tear that never truly fell before telling the nurses she needed air, then disappearing so completely that even the staff assumed she had gone home. Yet when I checked my phone during a brief moment when the doctors stepped out, I saw a tagged photo of her at a high-end restaurant in downtown Portland, smiling beside a glass of wine with the caption, "Blessed to take a moment to breathe," and I felt something inside me tighten in a way that made it hard to speak. When my father finally slipped away, the nurse on duty approached me quietly with a small plastic tray containing his personal items, his watch, his wedding ring, and his phone, which still had the hospital wristband sticker attached to the case, And when I powered it on to call Lydia, a flood of unread text notifications appeared on the lock screen, not from family or friends, but from the bank. There were withdrawal alerts, transfer notifications, ATM messages, all time-stamped within the last 48 hours, a period when my father had been fully sedated and unable to move his hands, let alone authorize transactions. And the more I scrolled, the harder it became to breathe. Standing beside his empty hospital bed with the faint smell of antiseptic filling my lungs, I opened the banking app and saw a list of transactions that made my skin go cold. Clusters of ATM withdrawals hitting 3 different machines across the city. Several app-based transfers routed to the same external account, an account listed under the name Lydia Turner, his wife. And even though I had suspected for months that she was capable of dipping her hands into places she should not touch, I had not expected it to be so blatant, so careless, so cruelly timed. My analyst brain took over, automatically pushing grief aside like a heavy curtain as I scrolled through the dates matching the withdrawals to the ICU charts I had memorized over the previous weeks, and I noticed a pattern. Almost immediately, money disappearing at times, when he was completely unconscious, times when only approved visitors could enter his room, times when Lydia would conveniently vanish from the hospital for hours, claiming errands or emotional exhaustion. And suddenly, every moment of suspicion that I had ignored now snapped into sharp focus. I sat down in the quiet corner of the ICU waiting area and began forwarding each SMS alert from his phone to my private email, making sure every message was saved. Then I exported the app logs one by one, so the digital trail would be preserved in case the bank attempted an automated purge, because I knew how financial systems worked. I knew how windows closed and how often evidence disappeared before anyone asked the right questions, and tonight the questions needed answers. As I backed up the files, I noticed another transaction buried between the withdrawals, a larger charge that stood out because of the amount and the destination, a $20,000 down payment processed through a real estate platform in California registered under Lydia's name, along with a second name I did not recognize. And when I clicked the link associated with the payment, it showed a property listing for a condo near Huntington Beach, a place my father had never visited, a place Lydia had recently mentioned only in passing while scrolling through vacation photos online and commenting how some people start fresh in better climates. The realization hit me slowly, like a tide rising inch by inch until the cold water reached my throat, because Lydia had not only been draining his accounts, she had been preparing for an entirely different life, one that did not include him, one that depended on his decline, continuing just long enough for her to secure her comfort, using money that was not hers. I sat there for minutes that felt unreal, surrounded by the soft hum of medical machines still running in nearby rooms, feeling the weight of 2 griefs, at once the loss of my father and the confirmation that the woman who claimed to love him had already begun moving on long before his final breath. I forwarded the real estate transaction to myself and marked it as critical evidence. Then I placed his phone gently into the tray and walked back into his room, standing beside his bed, while the machine slowly quieted and the nurses whispered condolences, and I made a silent promise that this would not be buried under sympathy posts and staged mourning, not when the truth was sitting in my inbox waiting to be used. In that moment, the pain did not numb me, it sharpened me, and I understood with absolute clarity that the woman who demanded my inheritance beside his coffin would soon learn that she had underestimated the wrong person, because the same skills I used to uncover million-dollar fraud schemes were now focused entirely on her, and every transaction she thought was cleverly hidden would become the foundation of her downfall. The morning of the funeral felt unreal, as if the gray Portland sky had lowered itself just enough to press on my lungs each time I tried to breathe. And when I arrived at St. Andrew Church carrying a box of printed photos for the slideshow, I saw the parking lot already crowded with relatives who had barely visited my father during his final months, but were now lining up to perform grief like it was a rehearsed play, and at the center of that gathering storm stood Lydia in a fitted black dress, her hair perfectly curled, her makeup flawless, her face twisted into an expression of practiced sorrow as she dabbed her eyes with a tissue that miraculously remained spotless. She greeted every relative with the same trembling voice, telling them how hard these months had been, how she had carried the weight of watching her husband fade away, how she barely slept, and how she prayed constantly. And each time she spoke those words, I felt a sting in the back of my throat because I remembered all the nights I slept upright in plastic hospital chairs while she posted filtered photos from wine bars and boutiques. I tried to keep myself busy so I would not explode, setting bottled water on the refreshment table, adjusting the folding chairs inside the hall, checking the slideshow one last time, and each time I passed near a cluster of relatives, I could hear Lydia's voice drifting through the air like a poisonous mist, telling them that I was only present because I wanted to ensure my inheritance did not slip into someone else's pocket, insisting she had cared for my father while I lived my own life, painting herself as a saint and me as a leech. And the worst part was seeing how easily some people nodded along, because it was simpler than questioning her story. During the service, I tried to focus on the sound of the organ and the rows of white lilies lining the aisle, but the heaviness in my chest only grew stronger as I watched Lydia sit in the front pew with her hand pressed dramatically to her forehead, letting out the occasional shaky breath loud enough for everyone around her to hear. And I realized she was performing for an audience she believed she had already won over. When the minister invited me forward to give the eulogy, I felt her eyes dig into the side of my face as if she expected me to stumble or fail. Yet the moment my hands touched the podium and the words about my father's kindness and resilience left my mouth, the church fell into a silence so complete that even Lydia's theatrics faded into the background, and for a moment it felt like the room finally saw him the way I did. But peace never lasts long around Lydia, and the moment the applause softened and people began shifting toward the center aisle, she stepped closer to me, her heels clicking against the floor in a rhythm that made my skin crawl. And when I returned to stand beside the casket with my hand resting on the polished wood, she leaned in so close I felt her perfume mix with the scent of lilies. With her voice barely above a whisper, she delivered the same ultimatum she had hissed at me in the hook, telling me to sign over the $700,000 or leave the family forever, saying it with the coldness of someone discussing a bill rather than addressing the daughter of the man she had just buried. And for a brief moment I tasted blood because I had bitten my lips so hard to keep myself from reacting. She expected tears, panic, maybe even a desperate plea, but what she saw instead was a quiet smile forming at the corner of my mouth, the same smile from earlier that unsettled her, and I responded with a single sentence that shifted the energy between us so abruptly I felt it ripple in the air. If you want to talk about money, then I will gather every piece of data first. My tone was calm, nearly gentle, yet it held a firmness she had never heard from me before, and I saw something flash across her eyes, confusion mixed with fear, as if she could sense that something inside me had changed. I stepped away before she could answer, walking toward the exit where relatives were lining up to offer condolences, and as I moved through them, I heard whispers, some sympathetic, some doubtful, but none as sharp as Lydia's words that still echoed in my mind like a threat carved into stone. When the service finally ended and people began drifting toward their cars, an older aunt I had not spoken to in years approached me quietly, her face lined by time and worry, and she pressed a small card into my palm with hands that trembled slightly, telling me to call her if I ever needed anything because she knew Lydia was not the saint she pretended to be, and she had suspected for years that something about the marriage was wrong. But until now, she had never had a moment to say it aloud. Her voice shook as she admitted she had stayed silent too long, and she looked away, as if ashamed, Yet that simple gesture felt like the first crack in the wall Lydia had built around her, lies the first sign that someone in this family was willing to see me, really see me, instead of swallowing whatever narrative Lydia fed them. As I stood in the parking lot with the wind rustling the edges of my father's obituary program and the card still warm in my hand, I knew that everything from this point forward would be different because Lydia believed she had backed me into a corner, but she had no idea that I had already started collecting the truth piece by piece, and once truth begins to gather, it does not stay quiet for long. When I got back to my apartment that night, the silence felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves understood what had shifted inside me, and after dropping my coat on the back of the chair, I powered on both monitors at my desk, the familiar glow filling the small Boise neighborhood living room that looked deceptively modest to anyone who ever stepped inside. On the left screen, I opened the full bank statement download I had sent to myself earlier, line after line of transactions, stretching down the page like a coded confession waiting to be deciphered. And on the right screen, I opened the hospital files I had access to through my father's patient portal, time-stamped updates from nurses and doctors, charting everything from his oxygen levels to the exact hour he became non-responsive. My hands hovered over the keyboard for a moment as grief washed through me again, but this time it did not slow me down, it sharpened me. And I created a blank spreadsheet with columns for date-hour medical condition and financial activity, a timeline that would tell the truth in a language that numbers could not distort. As I entered the first few lines, the patterns started emerging almost immediately, clusters of online shopping transactions that matched days when my father was heavily sedated spa payments processed at the exact times Lydia claimed she was sitting by his bedside, and a pair of airline ticket purchases routed to an account under her legal name, all of it hiding in plain sight like footprints left across fresh snow. With every entry I added, the anger in my chest became a steady hum rather than a chaotic storm, and I realized that this was the one place where my heartbreak could transform into action, where every inconsistency and every timestamp would become a piece of a truth Lydia could no longer twist. As I continued filling the spreadsheet, my phone buzzed beside me, and when I glanced at the screen, I saw an email notification from my manager with the subject line FBI request, and I opened it just long enough to read the first sentence, which said, "Jade, the Financial Crimes Unit would like to speak with you about one of your recent reports. They were impressed with your pattern recognition and want you to consult on a case." And for a moment, I stared at the words, feeling a strange mix of pride and frustration, because opportunities like that were career-changing. Yet I did not have the space in my mind to process anything other than the evidence forming in front of me. I closed the email without replying, letting it sink into the background noise of responsibilities I would eventually face, and returned to the spreadsheet where I began highlighting transactions that were impossible for my father to have authorized each mark, tightening the net around Lydia. The more I worked, the clearer it became that this was not a series of impulsive acts driven by stress or confusion, but a deliberate pattern built over weeks, maybe months, and I started pulling older statements from archived files to widen the timeline, discovering even more questionable withdrawals that aligned suspiciously well with Lydia's boutique visits and weekend trips that she had always framed as self-care. Every new connection fed a growing determination inside me, and I began organizing the files into folders labeled by date, ensuring that if I ever needed to bring this to an attorney or an investigator, I would have evidence so airtight that not even Lydia's practiced tears could wash it away. The room felt colder as the hours passed, and when I finally leaned back to rest my eyes, I noticed an unopened envelope among my father's belongings, one I had overlooked earlier in the chaos, addressed to his insurance agent with a carbon copy saved on his laptop, and something about the timing made me click through his email account again. Buried between newsletters and medical reminders, I found a message chain from 3 months earlier, a correspondence where Lydia had requested paperwork to update the beneficiary on his life insurance policy, and the agent had responded firmly that such a change could not be processed because my father was not considered mentally competent to sign. I stared at that email for a long moment, my heart tightening, because it meant Lydia had known exactly how much money was involved. She had known that the $700,000 were meant for me, and she had tried to reroute it quietly before his condition worsened, and when that attempt failed, she switched strategies and tried to corner me emotionally at his funeral instead. The realization sent a cold ripple through my spine, not because I did not expect this level of manipulation, but because seeing proof of it laid out in text made everything undeniably real, and it confirmed that the woman who claimed to have cared for my father had been planning her escape route long before he drew his last breath. I added the insurance emails to my evidence folder and labeled them, clearly feeling the shift inside me take deeper root, and as I saved the updated spreadsheet, I told myself that I would no longer react to Lydia's cruelty with silence or shock, because she was not dealing with the frightened stepdaughter she believed she could bully. She was dealing with a woman who understood financial patterns better than she understood her own reflection, and from this point on, every move I made would be deliberate. The apartment was quiet except for the soft hum of my computer, and in that moment I felt the first true sense of direction since my father's death, a calm clarity wrapping around me as I prepared myself for the next step, because with every line of data I entered, I was no longer the victim in her story, I was becoming the author of her consequences. By the next morning, the spreadsheet had taken on a life of its own, a blueprint of truth, arranged in careful rows and columns, and when I looked at it in the soft gray light coming through my apartment windows, I realized it was too big for me to hold alone, too heavy, too important. So I printed every file, saved every copy to a drive, and drove downtown to the law office where my father had quietly handled his affairs for years. The building was older with tall glass windows that reflected the steady Portland drizzle, and when I stepped inside, I immediately recognized the air of quiet authority that filled the lobby, the kind that came from decades of careful decision-making. Harriet Cole emerged from her office with the same calm presence I remembered from the few times I had met her while helping my father sign documents, her silver hair pinned neatly behind her ears, her glasses resting low on her nose, and her voice warm yet grounded as she said she was sorry for my loss before motioning me inside. I sat at the conference table and spread out the documents, the bank statements, the hospital logs, the timeline I had built through the night, and as I spoke, she listened with the kind of focus that made me feel seen in a way I had not felt in years, not as the stepdaughter Lydia dismissed, not as the quiet girl in the background, but as someone who understood exactly what was happening. When I finished explaining the patterns, she leaned back in her chair and let out a slow exhale, tapping one finger thoughtfully against the table as she reviewed the insurance documents already stored in her files, and she told me plainly that the $700,000 from the life insurance policy were legally mine entirely and without condition, and Lydia had no right to demand or pressure me to sign anything. Hearing those words felt like a rush of air filling my lungs for the first time in days, a confirmation that my father had trusted me with something meant to protect my future. And Harriet continued by saying that with the financial evidence I had gathered, there was enough to open an inquiry into whether Lydia had exploited a vulnerable adult, especially given the timing of the withdrawals and my father's documented medical condition. I felt my heartbeat quicken. Not from fear, but from a strange sense of readiness, because every step I had taken since the night he died now pointed toward this moment where silence was no longer an obligation, but a choice. And Harriet studied me for a moment as if trying to gauge which direction I intended to take. I told her I did not want a quiet settlement. I did not want to simply take the money and disappear the way Lydia likely hoped, because disappearing would allow her to continue creating her own version of the truth-spinning stories about sacrifice and loyalty that never existed, and Harriet nodded slowly, as if she had expected me to say exactly that. She leaned forward, lowering her voice slightly, and said that if I truly wanted clarity, I needed to bring the entire family into the same room, not for a confrontation born of anger, but for a presentation of facts so unmistakable that even the most loyal supporters of Lydia would have no place to hide, and the image formed so clearly in my mind that I could almost see the stunned faces as each slide revealed the truth. She suggested we hold the meeting in the small multi-purpose room at the church where the funeral had taken place, neutral ground familiar to everyone, and I felt a quiet flicker inside me as I imagined Lydia sitting among her audience with no script to guide her, no stage to control, and no way to twist the data that now contradicted her every claim. As Harriet began gathering the necessary forms, she paused and looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and firmness, warning me that once the truth was exposed, there would be no way to put it back, that the relationships within the family would shift permanently. And I nodded because the shift had already happened inside my chest the moment Lydia whispered her ultimatum beside my father's coffin. Before I left, Harriet opened a folder my father had left with her documents he'd been preparing but had not finalized before his health declined, and she told me something I had not expected, something that made my throat tighten, despite everything I had already learned. In the updated draft of his will, the one he had not been able to sign, he had planned to transfer full ownership of the Gresham home to me, removing Lydia entirely, because he no longer trusted her with the property he and my mother had built together. I stared at the document in silence, tracing his handwriting at the bottom of one page, and for the first time since his death, the weight of his trust settled into me. Not as grief, but as strength, a reminder that he had seen the same truths I was uncovering now. As I gathered my papers and prepared to leave, Harriet reminded me that clarity is not always gentle, but it is always necessary. And she asked me quietly what path I chose, whether I wanted to accept the money and walk away or shine a light into the darkness Lydia had created. I told her clearly that I would not let lies write the ending of my father's story, and she nodded, as if that answer confirmed what she already knew about me. As I stepped back into the drizzle outside the building, the question echoed in my mind, not from Harriet, but for anyone who had ever been forced to choose between silence and truth. And I found myself thinking, if it were you, would you stay quiet and take the money or bring light to every shadow? The day of the family meeting arrived with the same low gray clouds that had hung over Portland all week, and as I drove towards St. Andrew Church, my hands tightened around the steering wheel, because no matter how prepared I was, there was something surreal about returning to the same place where I had stood beside my father's coffin only days earlier. The multi-purpose room behind the sanctuary looked smaller than I remembered its beige walls and folding chairs arranged in a loose circle that made the space feel both intimate and exposed. And when I stepped inside, nearly every seat was already filled with relatives whispering among themselves, their voices a soft hum that shifted the moment they saw me. Lydia sat near the center of the room with her legs crossed and her purse displayed on her lap like a prop, her expression carefully arranged into a blend of wounded dignity and irritated impatience. And when our eyes met, she gave me a thin smile that carried the smugness of someone convinced she was moments away from watching me be publicly shamed. She believed this meeting was Harriet's idea alone, that I had been summoned like an undutiful child to explain myself, and the confidence in her posture was almost startling as she leaned back in her chair, whispering something to the aunt beside her, who nodded sympathetically without knowing a single fact. I walked to the table near the front of the room and connected my laptop to the television mounted on the wall, the screen flashing to life with the title slide I had prepared the night before, a simple header reading Financial Summary, Michael Reed's last 6 months, and as the bold letters filled the screen, a ripple moved through the room, the kind that happens when people suddenly realize they are about to hear something they cannot unhear. I turned to face them and began speaking with the same calm tone I used when presenting fraud findings to senior executives, not rushed, not emotional, simply factual. And for the first time since my father's funeral, the room belonged to me, rather than to Lydia's performance. I clicked to the first slide, which displayed the timeline of transactions, each withdrawal and transfer, paired with the exact medical notes from the hospital. And I explained how these entries aligned with periods when my father was physically incapable of authorizing anything, let alone multiple withdrawals across the city. And I watched as faces began to shift, uncertainty settling over expressions that had once been firmly on Lydia's side. Before anyone could interrupt, I moved to the next slide showing screenshots of Lydia's public Instagram posts, her check-ins at spas, nail salons, restaurants, and weekend retreats, each timestamp carefully matched to the questionable transactions, and a murmur spread across the room as people began connecting pieces they had never considered because Lydia had always been so convincing in her storytelling. I heard someone near the back whisper, "I remember that trip," but I thought she said Michael insisted she go, and I kept my voice steady as I explained how financial records mirrored her movements almost perfectly, as if the bank account itself had been documenting her days. When I revealed the email my father had sent his lawyer expressing concern about missing funds, several of the older relatives exchanged uneasy glances, and I saw a flicker of doubt crack the polished shell Lydia had wrapped herself in, yet she still sat upright with her chin lifted, as if waiting for the moment she could reclaim control. It came sooner than she expected because the next slide displayed the insurance company correspondence, the attempt to change the beneficiary 3 months earlier, the official refusal due to my father's lack of mental capacity, and the silence that followed was so heavy I could hear the soft buzz of the overhead lights. One aunt leaned forward, squinting at the screen, and asked, slowly, "Lydia, is this real? Did you actually try to change the policy?" And for the first time since the funeral, Lydia's composure cracked her face, tightening before she shot to her feet and pointed at me with a trembling hand while shouting that I had fabricated everything, that I was manipulating data, that I was a poisonous snake who had been trying to steal from her since the moment my father got sick. Her voice rose in pitch until the words tangled together and the room recoiled as her anger spilled over the certainty she had displayed earlier, dissolving into raw panic as she searched for someone to defend her. I did not respond, did not raise my voice, did not even flinch, because I had known that panic was coming ever since I started building the timeline, and instead I simply waited, letting the room absorb the contrast between her accusations and the evidence glowing on the screen behind me. Then the door opened quietly, and Harriet stepped inside with a folder in her hand, her presence instantly grounding the room as she walked to the table and placed a copy of the life insurance contract in the center. When she spoke, her voice was calm, yet carried the weight of authority that cut through every remaining whisper as she said, "Lydia, you called his daughter a snake, but the only person who attempted to take money from a dying man was you," and the entire room seemed to freeze the words, hitting with the precision of a gavel striking wood. Lydia's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her face blanching as she stared at the contract, at the signatures she recognized at the section, clearly stating that I was the sole beneficiary, and for a moment she looked smaller than I had ever seen her, like a person suddenly stripped of every script she had ever relied on. The relatives around her leaned back, some folding their arms, others whispering apologies to each other for ever believing her, and the shift was so palpable, I felt it like a change in air pressure, the moment where every lie Lydia had crafted finally shattered under the weight of facts she could not explain away. She understood then that she had been exposed in front of the very audience she had tried to maintain as her loyal circle. And as she sank slowly back into her chair, with her hands trembling in her lap, I realized that this was the moment my father had hoped I would be strong enough to reach the moment where truth stood unchallenged. For a long moment after Harriet's words settled over the room, nobody moved, as if everyone sensed that something irreversible had just happened. And when I finally exhaled, it felt like releasing air I had been holding inside my chest since the day Lydia leaned over my father's coffin and hissed her threat into my ear. The circle of relatives who once looked at me with suspicion and judgment now shifted uneasily in their chairs, their eyes darting between the screen behind me and the insurance documents on the table. And one by one, the expressions I had grown used to seeing on their faces for years began to crack. The aunt who had always believed every story Lydia fed her was the first to speak, her voice small but steady as she murmured, "Jade, I am so sorry, dear. I did not know." And her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for my arm before pulling back with a kind of shame that made her blink away tears. Another cousin who had once repeated Lydia's complaints about my supposed selfishness stepped forward with her jaw tight, as if she could not quite swallow the realization that she had been backing the wrong person. And then the uncle, who rarely spoke at family gatherings, stood up and cleared his throat, his voice rumbling through the room as he said, "We were wrong to think you only cared about the money. We should have seen how you took care of your father." His words carried a sincerity that made me feel suddenly warm and hollow, at the same time a reminder of how easily people can be swayed by a confident liar and how long it had taken for the truth to finally force its way through. Lydia sat rigidly in her chair while all of this happened, her face frozen in disbelief as she watched her allies slip away one by one, her shoulders shrinking inward as the reality of her isolation settled around her like a heavy coat. But the moment Harriet addressed the room again, Lydia snapped back to attention, leaning forward sharply when Harriet announced that the bank and the insurance company would now be reviewing the transactions and the attempted beneficiary change, a collaboration that could lead not only to repayment demands, but also to formal inquiries. The words formal inquiries seemed to slice straight through her as she lunged to her feet and stumbled toward me, grabbing my wrist with a desperation that made the room collectively inhale her voice, rising in a frantic pitch as she cried, "We are family, Jade. I took care of your father for years. I am the one who deserves that money. I earned it. You know I did." The panic in her eyes might have evoked sympathy in another context, but all I could see in that moment was the woman who abandoned my father in the hospital to take polished photos at trendy restaurants, who drained his accounts while pretending to pray over him, who tried to bully me next to his coffin for cash she did not earn and did not deserve. I pulled my hand free, slowly, deliberately, and I met her gaze without flinching as I said in a voice colder than the air in the room, "Family does not include someone who waits for her husband to fall into a coma before emptying his accounts," and the silence that followed was so absolute I could hear the hum of the old ceiling vent above us. Lydia's mouth opened and closed like she was searching for a script. She no longer had her eyes darting from face to face, as if hoping someone would step in on her behalf. But the relatives who once rushed to comfort her now turned away, their loyalty dissolving under the weight of the evidence scattered across the table and projected across the screen. Harriet stepped beside me with the calm authority she always carried and added one more piece of information that made Lydia sway slightly where she stood, explaining that if the investigation confirmed that she had exploited a vulnerable adult, which was the legal term used for someone too ill to protect their finances, she could lose not only the stolen funds but also the right to receive my father's pension benefits. The words pension benefits hit Lydia with visible force, and she reached for the back of a chair to steady herself, her breath catching in her throat as the implications settled over her, because the pension had been her safety net, her promised cushion for the lifestyle she believed she deserved, and losing it meant losing the future she had tried to secure by cutting me out entirely. The room stayed silent, the relatives watching her with a mixture of shock and grim acceptance. And as Lydia sank back into her seat with her shoulders shaking slightly, my own heartbeat finally slowed the anger and grief that had fueled me for weeks, shifting into a sense of clarity. For the first time since my father's passing, I felt the tide turning decisively, not just for me, but for the truth he had hoped would come to light. And though the consequences had only begun revealing themselves, the look in Lydia's eyes told me she finally understood that this was only the beginning of the price she would pay. The weeks that followed the family meeting moved with a strange mixture of relief and heaviness, as if the air around me had shifted, but my body had not yet caught up, and I buried myself in work, because numbers and patterns steadied me in ways human beings never quite had. On a gray Thursday morning, I drove to the downtown office of Cascade Federal's partner bank, where I had been scheduled to lead a training session on fraud detection for their staff, a routine part of my job that usually brought me a quiet sense of satisfaction. And as I walked through the glass lobby with my laptop bag over my shoulder, I felt almost normal for the first time in months. The session went smoothly with the employees asking thoughtful questions, their curiosity growing as I walked them through an emerging pattern of digital scams. And by the time I wrapped up the final slide, I felt the familiar focus that came whenever I worked a reminder that talent did not require validation to exist. I thanked the team and gathered my things, expecting to step into the crisp afternoon air and finally take a breath without the shadow of Lydia trailing me. But the moment the sliding doors opened, I froze because there she was, standing just outside the building, as though she had been waiting for hours. Lydia looked nothing like the polished woman who used to glide into church events with dramatic tears and professionally curled hair, her cheeks sunken, her skin pale beneath smeared makeup, her clothes wrinkled as if she had slept in them, and the hollowness in her eyes told me that this appearance was not rehearsed, but the result of unraveling. The second she saw me, she rushed forward her steps, uneven, her voice breaking into a desperate cry that drew stares from people passing on the sidewalk, and before I could react, she grabbed my arm with surprising strength and pulled herself against me in a shaky attempt at a hug as she sobbed, "Jade, please listen to me. I have lost everything. The bank froze my cards and none of the cousins will answer my calls, and you are the only one who can help me." Her tears soaked into the sleeve of my blazer, but I did not lift my arms to hold her instead, standing still as I felt the irony of the moment wash over me, because the same woman who had threatened to throw me out of the family beside my father's coffin was now pleading in the middle of the street like someone drowning. She looked up at me with trembling lips and said, "If you talk to the lawyer and tell her this was all a misunderstanding, she will listen to you. Please, Jade, please. I just need you to fix this," and I could hear the way she clung to the word misunderstanding, as if rewriting the story could erase the evidence stacked against her. I gently stepped back until her hand slipped from my arm, and I met her gaze with a calmness that felt like armor, telling her in an even tone, "You have not lost everything, Lydia. You still have what belongs to you. The only things you cannot have are the things that were never yours in the first place." And as the words settled between us, her breath hitched in disbelief, the raw entitlement in her eyes flickering like a flame, struggling to stay lit in the wind. For a moment, I wondered if she understood the significance of what she was asking me to do, not just to erase her wrongdoing, but to betray the truth my father had trusted me to protect, and the realization that she still viewed me as someone she could maneuver like a pawn brought a cold clarity that cut through any lingering pity. Lydia shook her head in small, frantic movements, insisting that she had cared for my father and earned whatever financial security he could offer her, and she reached for me again with a trembling hand as she repeated, "Jade, please, I cannot survive this without you." I stepped away once more, slow and deliberate, and let out a steady breath before speaking again, saying, Your survival is not my responsibility, and consequences do not disappear just because you are finally forced to face them. Her mouth opened in outrage, but before she could form another plea, I added something she had not known until this moment, something that made the last traces of color drain from her face, as if someone had pulled a curtain over the sun. I told her that after reviewing the initial transactions, I had asked the bank to monitor several additional accounts she held, including the account tied to a down payment made for a condo in California. And as soon as the words California condo left my mouth, Lydia stumbled back as though I had pushed her, her expression collapsing into pure terror because she had believed that account was hidden. She whispered, "How do you know about that?" But the answer was already reflected in my silence because she finally realized that her secret escape plan, the life she had hoped to start with someone else using money she siphoned from my father, was no longer protected by shadows. The fear in her eyes deepened her breathing, quickening as she looked around the sidewalk as if searching for an exit that no longer existed, and she pressed her hands to her mouth as if trying to keep her panic from spilling out into the open. In that moment, she understood that every direction she had tried to run was now lined with consequences, that the path she had carved out using deceit and manipulation was collapsing beneath her feet, and the weight of that realization finally bent her posture, like a tree snapping under too much wind. I watched her struggle to stay upright, watched the unraveling of the persona she had used for years to dominate conversations and twist narratives, and I felt no triumph, only a quiet certainty that I was honoring the truth my father had whispered to me when he handed me the insurance papers. I adjusted my bag on my shoulder and stepped around her, my voice steady as I said, "I hope you find a way to fix the part of your life that actually belongs to you." Then walked toward the parking garage without looking back as she stood frozen in the middle of the sidewalk with every escape route closing behind her. In the weeks after my encounter with Lydia outside the bank, the storm that had consumed so much of my life finally began to settle, even though the quiet that followed felt unfamiliar. At first, almost like stepping into an empty house after years of constant noise, and when the legal process reached its final stage, I received confirmation that the full $700,000 from my father's life insurance had been released directly to me, along with an additional repayment Lydia was required to make for the funds she had withdrawn without authorization, a sum she transferred only after her attorney informed her that refusing would trigger a far more damaging investigation. Holding that final document in my hands brought a wave of emotion that rose slowly, rather than all at once not joy and not revenge, but something steadier, a sense of justice settling exactly where it belonged. And I thought about my father's voice the night he gave me the envelope, about the way he squeezed my hand and told me to use this money to live freely, and I whispered a quiet promise to him as I closed the folder. With the financial dust finally clearing, I allowed myself to make decisions I had postponed for years, choices shaped not by fear or by Lydia's constant belittling, but by the independence I had earned and guarded in silence. And one of the first things I did was make an offer on a modest townhouse in a quiet Portland neighborhood, its brick exterior warm in the late autumn sun, and its ground floor perfectly suited for the idea that had been forming in the back of my mind since the fraud training session weeks earlier. After the sale closed, I spent evenings painting the downstairs walls, soft cream, and setting up a desk beside the window that overlooked the street where families walked their dogs each morning. And before long, the space transformed into a small consulting office where I could help local businesses identify patterns of financial abuse and digital fraud, a kind of work that felt like an extension of everything I had lived and learned rather than a separate chapter. The rest of the money I invested carefully in a mix of real estate opportunities and simple index funds choices that reflected the quiet confidence I had always carried in my own analysis and the knowledge that I no longer had to justify my financial decisions to anyone created a calm I had never experienced in childhood or adolescence years, during which Lydia had done everything she could to convince me that I was incapable of managing even the smallest responsibilities. My days settled into a peaceful rhythm as winter turned slowly towards spring, and I found comfort in the ordinary things I had once been too distracted or exhausted to enjoy waking early to brew coffee in my small but sunlit kitchen, tending to the potted herbs on my windowsill, checking emails while the city outside shifted from morning haze to clear daylight. One morning, I opened my inbox to find a message from a national financial crimes organization inviting me to be the keynote speaker at their annual fraud summit. The subject line simple but powerful, and as I read it, I felt the kind of validation that did not shout, did not boast, but hummed quietly in my chest because it belonged to me, and not to anyone else's version of who I was supposed to be. I did not post about the invitation on social media, and I did not text relatives to announce it, because I had learned that not every accomplishment needed an audience to be real, and part of reclaiming my life meant allowing myself to rise privately without performing success for anyone else. Yet despite the calm that had settled around me, a subtle ache lingered beneath the surface, the kind of ache familiar to many women moving through their late 20s or early 30s, a quiet grief over how often I had been underestimated or dismissed, how often my knowledge had been ignored until someone more powerful needed it. And I realized that my revenge had never been about punishing Lydia alone, but about correcting a lifetime of being seen as less than what I truly was. That ache shifted into something sharper the afternoon. A relative I had barely spoken to in years arrived at my office unannounced, a woman in her mid-50s whose nervous glances around the lobby told me she had rehearsed her decision to come for days before she gathered the courage to knock, and when I invited her to sit, she hesitated, as though unsure if she even deserved to take the chair. She confessed in a trembling voice that she had believed Lydia for years and had dismissed me as the dramatic one, the difficult one, the ungrateful one, and she looked down at her hands as she admitted that now she was the one trapped in a home where her husband controlled every dollar she spent and monitored every purchase she made under the guise of responsibility and order. She told me she had come because after seeing what I had uncovered and how I had stood my ground, she wondered if maybe I could help her understand her own finances, or at least help her see whether her husband's behavior was something she imagined or something real. And as she spoke, I felt a shift deep within me, an understanding that this was not just a single relative asking for guidance, but the beginning of something larger. I listened carefully and offered to review her financial statements, promising her that knowledge did not have to be frightening when shared with someone who believed in her, and the gratitude that spread across her face made something click in my chest, a realization that my story was not ending with revenge, but evolving into something far more meaningful. For the first time, I saw clearly that the quiet strength I had built could become a place of refuge for other women navigating shadows of their own, and the idea that had been flickering in the back of my mind finally began to take shape, bright and steady, showing me that perhaps the most powerful comeback was not simply surviving, but helping others rise beside me. There is a certain kind of quiet that settles only after a long storm, a quiet that does not erase what happened, but lets you finally breathe without waiting for the next blow. And as I sat in the small office I had built with my own hands, sunlight pooling across the floorboards, I realized that for the first time in years, my life belonged entirely to me. Looking back on everything that had happened felt like watching another woman's story unfold. A woman who had once stood beside a coffin with her hand on polished wood, while someone who claimed the title of family tried to strip away not just her inheritance, but her identity. And sometimes I imagined what might have happened if I had done what so many people expected and simply signed the paper Lydia shoved at me. If I had given away the $700,000 to keep the peace, there would have been neighbors and relatives who praised me for being mature or respectful, saying that maintaining harmony was more important than money. but deep down, I know I would not have been maintaining harmony. I would have been erasing myself piece by piece, just as Lydia had spent years training me to do. I thought about how many women had been conditioned to give up their own security for the comfort of others. How many had been told that sacrifice was the highest virtue and silence the only acceptable response. And I felt a quiet fire rise in my chest as I reminded myself that choosing myself had not been selfish, it had been necessary. The truth is that financial boundaries within a family are not signs of coldness or disloyalty. They are signs of respect, and no one, no matter how many years they spent married to your parent or how loudly they invoke the word family, has the right to decide that your labor, your intelligence, or your future belongs to them. If I learned anything from the months of unraveling transactions and exposing lies, it is that money in the wrong hands can become a weapon, one used to control, to guilt, to silence. And sometimes the only way to protect yourself is to reclaim what is yours without apology. Logic saved me. When emotions could not data-reveal truths, no argument could bury, and silence became not a sign of submission, but a strategy that let the facts speak louder than Lydia's theatrics ever could. And I realized that justice does not always look like police officers knocking on doors or judges pounding gavels. Sometimes justice begins quietly in the moment you refuse to sign something that you know in your bones is wrong. When I share pieces of my story with clients now, women who come to my office with trembling hands and whispered confessions about bank accounts they are not allowed to see or credit cards their husbands monitor, I tell them that survival often starts with one small act of defiance, one choice to believe their instincts, even if someone in their life has spent years convincing them those instincts cannot be trusted. I think about the older cousin who came asking for help, her voice breaking when she admitted that she had stayed silent for so long, because silence was what she had been taught. And I think about how many versions of her exist in households across the country. Women who keep shrinking because they believe that shrinking is safer than standing tall. As I looked out my window that evening, watching the sky turn lavender behind the rooftops, I whispered the thought that had stayed with me since the night of the funeral when I walked out of the church carrying both grief and determination, that sometimes the most dangerous thing a woman can do is learn her own worth and refuse to hand it over. If you have spent your whole life being told to stay quiet, maybe it is time to recognize that silence is no longer an obligation, but a strategy you can choose to abandon whenever you are ready and the moment you decide to speak. Even if your voice shakes, is the moment your life begins to truly belong to you. And if my story has touched something inside you, if there is even a small part that feels familiar, I would like to hear your own experience in the comments, because stories like ours matter more than people want to admit. If you believe that women deserve respect for both their labor and their assets, then subscribe to this channel so that no story like this stays buried in silence again.